My personal feeling is that this is how any further improvement of the world will be done, by individuals making quality decisions, and that's all. God, I don't want any more enthusiasm for big programs full of social planning, for big masses of people that leave individual quality out. These can be left alone for a while. There's a place for them, but they've got to be built on a foundation of quality within the individuals involved. We've had that individual quality in the past, exploited it as a natural resource without knowing it, and now it's just about depleted. Everyone's just about out of gumption. I think it's about time to return to the rebuilding of this American resource, individual worth. So, this is a timely message for right now, wouldn't you say? I've used this passage before, and I will certainly use it again. So let's talk about individual worth in relation to gumption. Just want to talk about that because there's a lot in this passage we can use, over and over again. Gumption is the psychic gasoline that keeps us going. Unfettered, it can do amazing things, but it often falls into traps, and we've talked about those traps, such as rigid values, ego traps, and fear, anxiety. We all have internal gumption traps, what Pirsig calls hang-ups. Our psychic energy gets hung up on internal stories, some very old, and becomes unavailable to us to go forward with where quality is directing us. And quality requires flexibility. So if this is happening a lot, if we get tripped up on these traps, we need to fix ourselves so we become more flexible. But one of the most difficult concepts we're facing right now is how to truly fix ourselves. Yet the only way we can do good in the world is to begin from a basis of good. But how can you connect with that good if you're all gummed up with these traps? And this also means good needs to be defined in the context of what is good in terms of the self. I propose it needs to have a metaphysical structure. The good of the self needs to have a metaphysical structure, and that structure is wholeness. To be as fixed as you can be means to be as integrated as you can be, and that's not going to ever be a final task because we're always changing, but we want to try to integrate as much of ourselves as we're conscious of. And sometimes that's going to take going into the unconscious, but I'll talk about that in a minute. We want to be as complete as we can be. And the more whole you are, the more integrated, the more tools at your disposal to handle what life throws at you. So, of course, you know what this sounds like. This is the Jungian concept of shadow, but let me try to explain it in terms of a practical understanding of why this is so important. There's a notion in trauma therapy that when you are hijacked by negative emotion, it is a transmission from an unresolved complex. And you could also say it's part of you that hasn't been properly integrated, and it has a perpetual narrative that's triggered, which makes it complex. So you could say that part hasn't grown up yet and reacts to the world at the age it was developed. Whatever the case, that part is not functioning in a helpful way to you as a whole adult person. What's typical to do with these complexes is to suppress them or avoid them. They don't feel good. They're uncomfortable, they're negative, they're painful. We already know that the negative emotions, grief, panic, anger, are painful to, say, an animal who's having anger triggered by an electrode in their brain. They're going to hit the lever to make it stop. But they don't feel good for a reason because in their pure form, they are indicators of low quality and that we should move to a higher quality situation or do something to transform that low quality. So the emotions themselves aren't the problem. They can help us, obviously. They help us survive. The problem occurs when these negative emotions arise for reasons that are not commensurate with the situation. We call this hijacking. So let's look at this phenomenon in the context of relationships, which is where we have the most problems, really, when you think about it. Someone irritates you. You're scared of someone. You're sad about how someone behaves toward you because they didn't read your mind. And yet, objectively, there's nothing in these people's actions that's directly angering, threatening, or betraying. These mirror the gumption traps we talked about. Value traps, for example. Your adversary is wrong because of some innate flaw. Ego traps. You can't possibly be bad. It's the other people who are bad. And fear traps. This person doesn't like me. Nobody likes me. And I'm going to be rejected. So then after the hijacking, we are ashamed because these parts are out of control and they've caused problems. When these parts hijack us, they can fracture relationships because they're so myopic and negative in their viewpoint. And as we said, they're very immature. These complexes are really old defenses or an old defensive narrative developed as children and teenagers, and those defenses create a suit of armor around us. The essence of shadow work is to penetrate that armor, which is made all the more difficult due to oftentimes revulsion, because behind the armor, the parts, especially the very young parts, are, say, vulnerable and want people to like them, so they may go to great self-debasing lengths to do so, or they've been so hurt by others that they see people negatively before they really have a chance to know them, and then act negatively towards those people and perpetuate negative reactions from those people. Therefore, really getting in there and dealing with those parts honestly is often the last thing we want to do, because it is just these parts of us we are so ashamed and angry at, because now they are causing a lot of trouble. I don't think there's a choice, though. You got to get in there if you want to fix this. Remember, the truth will set you free, so you really need to see the truths about yourself, which are behind the fortress of self-preserving narrative, and behind the fortress, behind the armor of these defenses. So how do you do that? It means you're going to have to start getting to know those parts, even if you are repelled by them, even if they are what cause you shame, and they probably are. These parts will remind you of things you've said and done that are humiliating. So the hardest thing to do if you want to fix yourself is to embrace that which you hate most about yourself. But it is in this embrace that the transformation begins, just as it does in any situation where a divide is healed with a gesture of peace. That peace releases barriers to gumption, and gumption in this case is the stance of openness to yourself and to others, a return of the flexibility you always had deep inside, which connects you to the vast outside. Because when you were born, you were a very flexible little person. If you can get those renegade parts on board and join, the rest of you, in those angry parts that fuel value rigidity, for example, you might be able to come to some better communication with others, because you will understand that both of you have a legitimate value framework. And you may agree in some places, you may disagree, but you can have a conversation. Value rigidity is a big problem these days. Say ego, for example. If you can approach that part of yourself that's so arrogant as a defense, and that can't admit that it's wrong, you have more flexibility with your ego. You can dial it up when you need to assert yourself and dial it down when humility is appropriate. And your part that fears rejection can work with all the parts to understand that you are valuable and you have individual worth, and so do other people. So what is good? An integrated self that has all its power to make sense of and respond in the best way at our present disposal to what the world presents to us. How do we do that? By freeing gumption from these traps and letting it do its job toward what is the highest quality response in any given situation. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.